That's close enough. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you so much for inviting me. I kind of feel like a little bit of homecoming since I spent many years in Berkeley as a student, so probably passed this area quite frequently, but it's my first opportunity to be here. Just a little bit of background about the book and why it was written and so forth, I think might be kind of useful. As was already mentioned in the introduction, I grew up in a laundry myself. My parents owned a laundry in Macon, Georgia. And we were the only Chinese in the whole community. And I've thought about that over the years, from time to time. And I was busy doing other stuff, so I never really got a focus on it. But once I retired, had a little, free time to concentrate on this, I thought it might be interesting to write about our experiences in Georgia, because they're different from Chinese in California, other areas where there are many Chinese. So that led to me writing sort of a memoir, which I titled Southern Fried Rice. And in the course of doing that, I did a lot of other reading on the side about other Chinese laundries and so forth, and the history of Chinese laundries well before my parents came to this country. And in the course of doing that, I learned a lot of interesting things that really fascinated me about the history of how Chinese laundries played a very significant role in American history, especially for Chinese Americans. And that's sort of what led me to write this book, Chinese Laundries. Now, something about the title. Hardest thing about writing a book probably is coming up with a title. I focused a lot on tickets as a symbolic representation of both how Chinese and Chinese laundries were perceived by mainstream or Anglo-America, and also the sort of role that it played for Chinese. So here's a picture of a very typical laundry ticket that Chinese laundries used. And you can see that on the bottom half, there's an inventory of whatever clothing, how many of each article that the person brought in, so that the laundryman could reassemble the package and price it, and then return the laundry to the customer. However, people who couldn't read Chinese would look at this and they'd say, "Oh, chicken scratch." And they would make fun of Chinese characters, written as well as spoken. And so for them, the Chinese laundry and its ticket sort of represented sort of a, foreign exoticness and something sort of that was often treated with derision, kind of somewhat hostile humor at times. Now, on the other hand, while Chinese did a lot of other occupations, such as fishing, lumber work, farming, manufacturing, and so forth, the laundry really was the very first form of self-employment on a large scale that the Chinese immigrants entered into. And as I don't need to tell you that in 1882, the Chinese were excluded from entry into the United States, with a few exceptions. And this created a very difficult economic survival for the Chinese, who were adaptive enough to find a niche and eke out their existence. So there was a window of opportunity, probably in the late 1800s, early 1900s, before white laundry started escalating on a larger scale. But for a while, the Chinese kind of got the foot in the door, and this is what enabled them to be able to not only make enough money to send home to their relatives, in China, but also to survive themselves. So that's why I called the laundry ticket as sort of an entryway, sort of a passport that enabled the early Chinese and their descendants to survive in America. As you might imagine, Chinese immigrants who came from Guangdong to the United States were not laundrymen in China, as some people who are unsophisticated about this may have thought. You know, they'd ask me, well, oh, you know, did your father run a laundry in China or something? No way. You know, in China, as in everywhere else, women did the laundry. Men, you know, this is not a feminine occupation anywhere in the world. So this is a commentary from a laundry trade journal, a white laundry trade journal. You may not be able to read it well in the back, but basically it's a commentary to say, you know, this is an observation by a white person saying, you know, it's kind of interesting. We went to China and we didn't see any laundries over there. How come they got so many laundries over in the United States? You know, it's kind of like a paradox in a way. So they're sort of pointing out that, you know, Chinese laundries are something that are a phenomenon that exists outside of China. They're not unique to the United States, by the way. I found, like in New Zealand, there were lots of Chinese laundries. And in many other parts of the world, at that time, the Chinese who went there found that laundry was a way to make money. No, not a lot of money, but enough to live on. And they were able to do this because other people didn't want to do this kind of work. Who wants to take other people's dirty, smelly laundry and work with it? So, because no one else wanted to do it, Chinese did it. And then later it became contested as, you know, other people saw that this was a financially lucrative thing. So I kind of wondered, you know, if the Chinese immigrants, like our ancestors, had come 100 years later, what would they have done? There would be no need for laundrymen now. Everyone's got a washing machine at home and so forth. There are new fabrics and so forth. So it was kind of a, you know, a little unique opportunity in history. So let me kind of start with just giving you a few visual images, some of which you may have seen before. Here's a sign in New York City talking about Chinese laundry. Hand laundry, by the way, was commonplace initially, but then eventually, certainly by the 1920s and later, most of those hand laundries had become steam laundries in some form or another, or else they were mainly like pickup stations where they sent the laundry out to a wet wash factory, and then they would send them back mainly for ironing. Here are a couple of early pictures of laundries which actually had horse and buggy delivery systems, which I think were rather uncommon, but there were a lot of Chinese who were go on foot, going from neighborhood to neighborhood, picking up laundry and bringing it back to their laundry to do, and then delivering it. Here you can see there's a wide variety. There's no one standard format of the architecture. Usually the Chinese found some inexpensive, rundown, beat-up, dilapidated structure, and they operate their laundries there, and many of them live in the back or on top of the laundry. It is quite commonplace for immigrants to have that sort of life situation. And this was true for the many Chinese who also did grocery stores in you know, small towns and throughout the country. Here in the middle is actually a laundry which still exists. There aren't that many left. And that's one reason why I felt compelled to try to write something about laundries while some people still remember them, you know, because the newer generation really won't know anything about these laundries. So the Sung Lee Laundry still exists in San Diego. In fact, I even visited there last week and went and talked to the owner, and they've been there for some 60 years. It's a, you know, second generation business. But increasingly, these laundries are, you know, either going out of business, or certainly their children are not interested in running them because they have benefited and from the earnings that their parents provided for them so they could get a college education and become, you know, professionals. Here are 3 laundries with the name Sam Lee. I picked that partly because it's one of the most common names of Chinese laundries. I'm sure probably many of you have encountered one. And also for personal reasons, because the laundry on the far right, Family Laundry, was the laundry that my parents owned, and we lived above, and those three windows are the front windows of our laundry. And if anyone ever wants to know what hot means, go to a place like Family Laundry in Macon, Georgia in August, and go upstairs after the laundry's been operating all day, and you'll really know what hot is, In Canada also, the history of Canadians, immigrants, Chinese Canadians, and Chinese Americans are very similar. The role of the laundry was very similar for them. They also worked on railroads. They also worked in laundries in various rundown parts of Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, the big cities, as well as small towns. This is just a small depiction of the geographic representation of the density of Chinese laundries. I think at one time it was estimated like 2,000 Chinese laundries in New York City, which I kind of found hard to believe that it would be that many. But many of them clustered around the downtown part. But as you can well imagine, having too many laundries too close together is not a good thing, because there may not be enough business to go around. There'll be, people will be stealing each other's customers. In fact, in many towns, Chinese associations would work out an agreement, rule that, like no two laundries could be within, X number of buildings to each other, so that everybody could sort of have their own territory, as it were. So most small town laundries that I researched are kind of downtown. They're sort of in a business district. In a metropolitan area, let's say, such as San Diego on the left and Montreal on the right, there were a fair number that were out in neighborhoods further away, so they could have their own territory. But most of them congregated toward the downtown area. Now, interestingly, I pointed out earlier, Sam Lee is the most common name, but a lot of laundries would have Lee in it. And people would think, well, boy, the Lee clan sure is into laundry very heavily. But the fact of the matter is, many of these laundries were not owned by people named Lee. They could have been Wongs, they could have been Chans, they could have been other, names, because the Chinese character for profit is also pronounced the same way as the Chinese surname Lee is pronounced, and so they're very similar sounding. So when you phoneticize it into English, it comes out L-E-E, but the real meaning of it was profit. So Sing Lee, I think, I'm not entirely sure, is something like, forever profitable or big profit or something. So a lot of these laundries, it was sort of like the equivalent of, wishful thinking. You bless this laundry with a name saying, Forever Victorious was one translation that someone told me was the name of one of the Chinese laundries. It wasn't like, Joe Smith's Laundry. Oh, there were some laundries named after a particular person. Like in my book, I have a narrative of a woman who grew up in her family laundry, the Frank Wong Laundry, named after the father, Frank Wong. But on the other hand, many laundries took the names of these sort of prosperous-sounding terminologies. I went and looked in the 1910 census, for example, and I calculated, I added up how many names were Sing Lee and Sam Lee, and also the reversals, because the immigration offices frequently reverse names, so I looked at Lee Sing, and there were quite a few of them. And I calculated 73% of these men, Sam Lee, Sing Lee, and Lee Sing, ran laundries. And if you look at census schedules around that era, the vast majority of these men were running laundries or working in laundries. It wasn't until about like 1920 census that you start seeing a lot of people in the restaurant. So, the laundry certainly preceded the restaurant. Here are some images that will maybe better give you an idea of how Chinese and Chinese laundries were viewed by the general public. So cartoonists would sort of make fun. On the left, you can sort of see it's sort of like a Darwinian representation of how the Chinese evolved. And I guess if we use Chinese approach, we start over on the right side and we see a Chinese man with his pigtail, then he sort of metamorphoses over toward the left and he becomes a washboard as his torso, and that was one sort of characterization. On the other side, we see a man running with a bag of laundry on his back. I'm going to make a general cleaning is the caption there. So popular magazines of the time, newspapers, when they wanted to represent Chinese as a cartoon character, like a political cartoon, would very frequently use the Laundryman to represent all Chinese. This is a drawing that comes from a recent book called The Chinatown Trunk Mystery, which is an excellent book to explain attitudes toward the Chinese in New York City, probably around the early 1900s. There was a unsolved murder mystery where a white woman who was a young missionary was found. She had been murdered, and she was found in a trunk, steamer trunk that was in Midtown Manhattan, which is rather far from Chinatown, but it was occupied by two Chinese men, and these men disappeared and they were never found. So obviously the inference was that one of these Chinese laundrymen had murdered her. And so there was concern that there were many white missionary women who were spending a lot of time trying to teach English to the laundrymen and, recruit them into, the church and so forth. So this drawing depicts the evil Chinese laundryman. There he is preying on this woman that he has maybe a dagger or something in his arm. But these were like sensationalistic drawings that were trying to create this panic. And then on the other hand, you go the other extreme. Instead of the story about the evil, wicked, sinister Chinese, here we have the lighthearted, sing-song Chinese laundryman who is celebrating his day off, no washi tu te, at the Long Sing Laundry. I don't think this song was really popular. It wasn't like Chinatown, My Chinatown, but there were a lot of songs like this, old song sheets where you find sort of like cartoon-like jest at Chinese and using the laundry as an image. And we also have various tchotchkes here. The cork stopper on a bottle of liquor is on the left. In the middle is a piggy bank using a Chinese icon. And on the right is actually a laundry bag that a hotel used for their guests if they wanted to leave laundry outside their door to be picked up and cleaned the next day. That was the laundry bag, and you would just hang it on your door. Now, I don't know if I can get these films to work. We'll see. There are some incompatibilities with computers, but this is a laundry film. Okay, briefly, it's a silent film that Thomas Edison made. It has really nothing to do with the laundry in a way, but it's sort of like a frivolous sort of thing. It's like a Keystone Cop thing where someone is chasing what appears to be a Chinese laundryman. The Chinese laundryman ends up kind of hiding from him and hitting the policeman on the head or something like this. This, to the point, is another flagrant example of the attitudes created toward laundrymen. This was actually a commercial postcard that was sewed, sort of suggesting that you could learn how to be a laundryman by taking a correspondence course. You don't have to work, there's no washing, there's no worrying, no checking, no shirting, no trusting. After the first lesson, you begin to turn yellow. After the second lesson, your eyes will slant. And it kind of gets a little worse. But you get the general idea. As far as I know, since I can't really read Chinese, I know the bottom two characters I'm told are totally fabricated. The top one is the symbol for profit. So we got part of it right. That was a common part of a Chinese laundry name. Now, not only was there exclusion in 1882, but there were attempts to drive the Chinese out. In other words, the ones that we here are, not only we're not going to let any more in, but let's try to get rid of the ones here. And again, the laundryman was used as the symbolic representation of let's get rid of the Chinese because their cheap labor is undercutting white labor, and in a time of economic depression like in the 1870s, pretty much, hard times until 1900s, Chinese were the scapegoat because the Chinese worked hard and for less money, and so Chinese were not welcome in the United States. This set of pictures is to make a point about how immigration treated the Chinese. As you may know, if you were a merchant, you could still come to the United States. But if you were a laborer, you could not. And the reason for that is, economic. If you were a merchant, then that meant there would be trade between China and the United States in some sort of way. There'd be some economic benefit. Now, if you left the country and you came back, you had to prove that you were a merchant and not a laborer. Now, here's a case of a man, Li Wong, I believe is his name. He was in Massachusetts. He went back to China for a visit because many Chinese made frequent trips back to China. And when he came back, he couldn't get back in, even though he had the paperwork. So on the one side, we have the interior of the building where he worked. And it's kind of hard to see in this light, perhaps, but over here are articles that look like they could be like part of a grocery store, merchandise to sell. Over here are parcels of laundry, and this is the man in question. So the immigration felt that he was really a laborer or a laundryman and not a merchant. He wanted to claim that he was a merchant. But they said, you had laundry here, and that these really were food items that would be provided for people who were boarders in his building. The outside of the building clearly says it's a laundry. There's a little sign somewhere that sort of says it might be a food store, but it's not very visible. So the upshot of this was he was denied re-entry into the country, even though he got an affidavit, which you won't be able to read, but it sort of says, "We the undersigned," because what you had to do was to get at least 2 witnesses. Preferably, or almost by necessity, they had to be white. They certainly probably couldn't be Chinese because they would be, less credible. And you basically had to say something like, "We know this guy, and he has not done any labor. We have never seen him work." In the sense of like manual labor. We've seen him run a store, and he's a nice guy and everything, but we've never really seen him break a bead of sweat. I mean, that's the gist of what you had to claim. And if you could get that, then you had a fighting chance of getting back in. So in this case, the poor guy didn't get back in. A second case that was very similar in Olympia, Washington, you can sort of see the pictures. These are also from the National Archives. This is the outside of the building. It says laundry. This is the inside of the building. Here, it looks like there might be a laundry too there. Here, there's some canned foods and so forth. And so anyway, they got the witnesses to testify, that door usually isn't open. It's usually locked. And I think the laundryman, when he came back, he said, I don't know where all that other stuff came from. It wasn't here when I left, Someone sublet the building and put that stuff there, It's like I've been framed or something, So this is basically saying, like, during this time, I have never known him to engage in any work or labor except in the store, said business or something. And you get 2 white people to sign a notarized statement. So this guy was lucky, and he was able to get back into the country. So not only were there those kinds of problems, there were legal problems, unfair laws that were discriminatory. Probably the most famous case actually occurred in San Francisco, case of Yitwo versus Hopkins. And that's basically the law against having laundries in wood buildings. And under the ostensibly reasonable argument that wood buildings are fire hazards, especially if you have a laundry in there, because in those days you had to heat coals and so forth to in the drying room so you could dry the clothes to a certain point. And indeed, there were some laundries that did burn. But the gist of it was the problem was that this law, if enacted, would undercut all the Chinese laundries and not the American laundries. And it actually went to the Supreme Court, and he prevailed, and this law was tossed out because it violated equal protection. So, but they didn't always win all the cases. But there were many other cases. Some these you won't be able to read, certainly in the back. But basically, like on the left, I'll just sort of say, since the laundrymen lived in their laundry, why do they live in their laundry? One is to save money. Number two, probably for security, because they live late, they work late at night, and if they lived somewhere else, they'd have to walk out late at night, and they'd be in danger of physical harm. And also, some of them worked a lot. If they didn't get the work done on time, they'd work until late at night until it was finished, or they'd get up at the crack of dawn. So anyway, so the law is passed, you can't work in the store after a certain hour. I don't know, it was 10 o'clock or something. So in LA, a policeman was walking around at 1 a.m. He suspected work was going on in a certain laundry. He crept around to the rear of the place. He suddenly rushed, pushed in the door. He found two Chinamen scrubbing industriously. Okay, major offense. They shouldn't be there after 10 o'clock scrubbing anything. Okay, they're violating the law that you can't work in your store at 10 o'clock. And so they hauled him off to jail and fined him. On the right-hand side is a news article about a white laundry association, which was creating a sort of a war chest of money because they wanted to drive all the Chinese laundries out of business in Brooklyn or somewhere back in, the bottom says they wanted to remove every laundry operated by Mongolians in New York, Brooklyn, and New Jersey. So you can sort of see that now laundry business is being contested. They're no longer content to let the Chinese have the laundry business to themselves. The white steam laundries are, taking issue and politically and economically are trying to drive the Chinese out of the business. There was some, ambiguity about whose laundries were more hazardous. This is a drawing from an ad in a Vancouver newspaper or British Columbia newspaper. The caption says, "Do away with this, patronize a white laundry. White laundry only, white labor only at Pioneer Laundry." So they wanted to show the Chinese spitting or spraying onto the laundry to moisten it, to iron it, which was a problem that the early laundries, that probably was the case. Then later they sort of developed something that was a mister that you would like blow through the pipe at the end and you get a thin spray of moisture. But interestingly, at least in one case, and this was like in the 1920s, was an article where the city health department found that the white laundries were even more hazardous. It was kind of debatable at that point, but you can sort of see each side is trying to sort of claim the other side as more of a risk. The white laundries, because they had a higher volume of clothes, they would often bundle a lot of laundries from different people in the same net, and so as people became very aware of contagious diseases and everything, there was a lot of concern. I don't want my laundry mixed up with someone else's laundry. But you're not going to find a big laundry washing each person's laundry individually. So that was a bone of some contention. There was also violence as well as maybe miscellaneous shenanigans. This article is about some adolescents going around and breaking windows in a laundry. And the owner calling the policeman and saying, "These are the guys who did it." There were some Irish adolescents, and turns out that the captain of the police precinct was also Irish, and so the article sort of sort of says at the end, well, it's called the theory of E. Lee, that E. Lee sort of felt that the reason why the policeman didn't take any action was because the offenders were Irish and the policeman was Irish. So it was sort of written up in a sort of a tongue-in-cheek thing about his theory. This is an article about a funeral of a laundryman who was attacked in his laundry, and he was clubbed over the head, and he died from this. And the news article sort of, while it reports that, it kind of goes on into other things, like the bottom line says, when the Chinese witnesses, in describing the attack, became excited and lapsed into pidgin English, the spectators laughed aloud. Now, nowadays, one probably wouldn't find it necessary to add that sort of, footnote to the article, but that seemed to be the way journalism worked in that time. Another part of the article, instead of criticizing the assault, sort of makes mention of, this is the first time that a heathen had received religious services in Christian church. And it's almost like they were saying, well, he should be happy that he's being given a Christian burial. Now, turning to laundry experience itself, this is from a narrative around 1900, and I know you probably can't read the back, so I'll just read parts of it. This is a guy who came over. He said, when I first handled the dirty clothes, I could not take the smell. I almost threw up. Father saw my reaction and comforted me. Take your time. Picking up these clothes is even worse than moving corpses back in China. I never mentioned the unhealthy condition of the laundry in my letters to China. Knowing those things would not do my family back home any good. Frankly, I was busy from dawn to dusk. How could I find time to write about these things? I always wrote back to my family, I am well and healthy here, no need to worry. It didn't matter whether I was well or sick. Being here, you just had to endure. And I read a lot of narratives where the theme is like endurance, it's sort of like persevere. It's like, it's a rough life, but you gotta sort of hang in there and do it. Here we're talking about some other experiences. The irons weighed 8 pounds each. When the iron was hot enough, we took it off the stove. This is the hand laundry before the steam laundries. And iron until the iron cooled down, then you heated it up again, and after ironing all day, marks would appear on your palm, blisters would turn to calluses so thick that even if you cut them open with a knife, it would not bleed. Many Chinese had health problems after only 3 years of laundry work, and so forth. You get the general theme that it was a very difficult, physically demanding occupation. This is a photograph looking out toward the front of the laundry. You can see it's pretty Spartan inside. There's a couple of tables on the side, which are the ironing boards, which for many laundrymen doubled up as their bed at night. Just put something over it and sleep on the ironing board rather than have a bed. Because remember, they lived in the laundries. These are just some sketches that occurred in popular magazines such as Leslie's Spectator, which was a popular magazine of the late 1800s, just sort of artist sketches of Chinese laundrymen at work. This is a narrative from a laundryman's wife. This is from Montreal. A woman came to live in Canada. Her husband was 20 years older. He was a laundryman. We were introduced by matchmakers, as I'm sure you all know, that was quite the custom at the time. He was 27 when he came here. We saw each other again when I came over 10 years later. So many Chinese came over, may have worked for a while, gone back and got married. Some of them brought their wives over, some of them did not. Those that did not would maybe go back every few years, and then they would maybe procreate, have more children, come back to the laundry, make money, send it back. So in this case, his wife finally came over after a while. Let's see. She came to help in the laundry. She had to be careful because if we damaged any of the garments, we'd have to pay for them. I washed everything myself. I washed as many as 50 shirts. We just worked in the laundry. ourselves and did the washing. My husband did the ironing. Now, some did have employees, some of them did have other relatives help out. In this case, it was just the husband and wife. When there was more work, we had to stay up and do it. We'd work late at night, sometimes till 11 at night, and so forth. So, and then she also comments about how they would get teased or harassed a lot by people coming in and in this case, screaming Chinatown, Chinatown, or whatever, whenever we would say anything. There were children who were very bad. They would throw snow at our clothesline where the clothes were going to dry. So you'd wash the clothes, hang them out, they're clean, and then kids would come by and throw mud at them, and then you'd have to start all over again. Well, that was just another experience. I won't take time to read. This is another picture of an interior. This is a laundryman who actually had his family with him. You can see he has two small sons with him standing in the back. This is it's not a portrait as such. You can see everyone is standing very stiff like in the old photographs. He knew his pictures would be taken. These are his two sons in front of some laundry packages. This is the front counter, and the customers will be on this side. There's a sewing machine, there's the abacus, and usually there's a partition here, and in the back might be the sleeping quarters, the eating quarters, and maybe the washing equipment, and so forth. This diagram, it's a little crooked here. The building's not really that bad, but this is a sketch from a well-known book that came out called The Chinese Laundrymen, which I'll say a little bit more about later, by Paul Su. But he has a diagram of sort of a generic laundry, like this is the front space, which would be this space. This is sort of the counter. Maybe this would be the drying room, where there'd be a heater, a stove here that burned coal or something, and then there'd be wires around, and the clothes would be hung up to dry to a certain level. In the summertime, maybe they can hang them outside. If you lived in a cold climate, in the winter, you'd have to do it indoors. Here might be a wash tub. Maybe these might be sleeping arrangements, facilities, cooking facilities, and so forth. So the laundry is all kind of self-contained in terms of living and workspace. Here's just a couple of photographs of some people that I got to write narratives. The family on the right, they are in Southern California. The little girl in the picture, she wrote a narrative in my book about her family and how difficult their life was in LA, and kind of describes the family situation economically and sociologically. This family, you can see that women, the mothers not only did the food preparation for the family and so forth, but very often had to spend a lot of time working the laundry. This is a couple in a San Diego laundry where you can see that the wife is working side by side with the husband pressing clothes. This is an excerpt. I don't know if I can get it to work. Let me see. Nope. All right. 8-Pound Livelihood, I would have liked to have shown you. It's a film that was made about 1980 in New York. And it really sort of shows you inside the laundry while it's actually operating. And you get a much better flavor for the intensity of the work, the level of the workload. One thing I did in my book was, instead of just focus only on the laundrymen themselves, was to look at children like myself who grew up in the laundry. Like, what was that for us? How did we see it? How did it affect us? What did we think about it? So here, as you can see, the Frank Wong laundry, which I described earlier, these are the Wong children, 4 children in Hollywood, California. In the back of their laundry, this is where they ate, this is where they did their homework and sat and watched TV, and all their possessions around here. You can see their suitcase up here and so forth. Here they are on the very proud occasion. What other ethnic group, other than probably some Asian group, would you get the whole family to sit out in front of the laundry and pose in front of your new set of encyclopedias? So this was like a significant event for them. Other kids would maybe sit in front of their bicycle or their Nintendo or something, but they were especially thrilled to to be able to get this set of encyclopedias. This is another one of the writers in the book, Elwin, who worked in his father's laundry in Vancouver, and here he's bundling some packages and so forth. And so children lived in the laundry, they worked in the laundry, and some of them, like me, tried to find ways to get out of work. I would go outside and pretend I was going to be a baseball player someday. So this is just a small sample. So what was interesting is I got about 7 or 8 people who grew up in a laundry to write without knowing what anyone else was going to write. And actually one of the people who wrote is here today, so you might want to talk with her later, sitting here right in the front row. She was kind enough to write about her experiences, Liz Chan, writing about growing up in Louisville, Kentucky. Didn't get a picture of me though. So here are just a few descriptions from some of these. In Vancouver, he talks about our living quarters were located on the 2nd floor above the laundry. That's very, very typical, either above the laundry or behind the laundry. There were 3 bedrooms. My 2 sisters shared a room with our maternal grandmother. My parents shared a room with one of my brothers, and I shared a room with 2 other brothers. So nobody has their own room. I mean, that would be unheard of. You'd be lucky to have, a room with only 1 or 2 other people. My brothers and sisters and I started off folding small fluffy items such as towels. As we got older, we were assigned more difficult tasks, such as feeding damp linens into the mangle, which is the massive flat iron for pressing bed sheets and tablecloths. I spent the bulk of my boyhood folding, packaging, and organizing customers' linen. My time was also spent reconciling differences between customers' linen count against the actual count I had in front of me. Very often there'd be disputes with customers, and we as children would have to often negotiate these disputes. Customers would be complaining that, oh, we lost a shirt, and very often they'd be quite vehement about it. And then the following week they would come back and say, oh, my wife found my shirt at home after all, sorry that I made such a big ruckus. But at the time, it was a very unpleasant sort of thing to have to deal with. Or they'd want you to pay for something, that, oh, you damaged this or that. And so there would be those situations where many of us, our parents really weren't either proficient in English to deal with that. And so depending on the age of the children, we would be the translator and the negotiator. Here's another account. My parents worked long hours every day. We had no vacations, no trips to Disneyland, no other fun events. Working on a laundry was, 52 weeks a year kind of thing, because you can't just say shut down for 2 weeks and say go on vacation, because you lose all your customers. They, if you were lucky and you had relatives who could mind the shop, maybe you could do it. But I know that I myself didn't know what a vacation was. I mean, our family never took a vacation. We'd come back to school in September, and I guess one of the first things the teachers would do would have everybody go around the room and say what they did for their summer vacation. And I always remember that, well, I don't really have anything to say, So I kind of felt a little bit bad about that, but it just didn't mean anything to me. What is a vacation? Every Monday through Friday, my father opened the laundry from 9 a.m. Now, actually, my father would probably opened earlier than that, but before opening, he'd probably be there at like crack of dawn to get things going. Anyway, we were required to be there well before opening and work long after closing. So you get the general picture that we grew up in the laundry. And there were some bad things about that, and I think I can sort of say there were some good things. Certainly the parents knew where the children were. The parents didn't have to worry, where are your kids now? They're right there, they're working or doing their homework. So whether we liked it or not, we were supervised. We sort of were bonded to each other. And here, all of us children worked in the laundry with our responsibilities varying with age. I remember waiting on customers who dropped off or picked up laundry, folding socks, so forth. And so some of this is similar. Work days were long. We only had Sundays off. And Sundays off usually even meant repairing equipment and so forth. If equipment broke down and things like that, maintenance. All of us work in our laundry, our responsibilities varying with age and so forth, and we've already sort of mentioned that in an earlier account. As the family increased in numbers, mother had less time to work in the laundry, dad had her do the mending and sewing. We ate only Chinese meals as she was in charge of all the food preparations for the family, and also provided lunch for the workers. So she had a full job there. Dad usually had 2 to 4 Chinese employees and 5 female ironers, usually white women, to hand finish the shirts. So, and as I remember, my mother was busy all the time too, either like bringing up the children, taking care of the meals, going shopping, and so forth. So there was really very little kind of downtime. Even today, or even though these ads are probably from the 50s or 60s, but certainly relatively recent times, there was some sort of ambivalence about how Chinese would be portrayed, either kind of as clever or as stupid. On the one ad, on the left, no washi, no tiki, no washi, keeping it simple. Basically, what this ad sort of says is, you know, the Chinese don't have a complicated system here. They've got this abacus, they've got everything kind of simple bookkeeping, and this is sort of managerial suggestion that, you know, if it's simple, it works well. They simulate a Chinese ticket there, but all the characters are the same. I think, what is that, the number 4 or something? But 7? 7, okay, lucky 7 was it. But clearly, the Chinese didn't do it because the characters shouldn't all be the same. All right, on the right, we have an ad for Texaco Oil, where a Chinese laundryman is busy on the phone, probably calling the fire department while his shirt is burning. You know, he left the iron there. So basically, the ad is saying, like, smoke means trouble. You know, if your car is smoking, you better get help. So Chinese imagery was used culturally, you know, in society to kind of stereotype the Chinese laundryman. And even in relatively recent times, here is kind of a little parody sort of thing saying, and this was before the Beijing Olympics came about, this was maybe a few years back earlier. Sort of saying, oh, you know, why don't we make laundry an Olympic sport? And then they said, oh no, we can't do that, the Chinese would have an unfair advantage. And then they said the Chinese government is meanwhile busily preparing new detergents and so forth. And then they talk about having so like an Astrodome. They're going to make a gigantic stadium that will seat 30,000. It's going to be shaped like a laundromat. All right. So, you know, whether you consider it funny or not, but it's sort of like, still shows stereotype that Chinese are just experts on laundry. And probably more recently, and you may have heard about this, a well-known national clothing manufacturer for young people especially, put out these t-shirts called Wong Brothers. And there's a sort of motto, 2 Wongs can make it white. And there was a lot of protest about this, especially younger generation activists were offended by this and pressured Abercrombie and Fitch to remove this. I don't know that they did or didn't. They did finally, but I think with some resistance. And then less celebrated, but there was also an ad put out by some company. That's supposed to be a laundry bag, and in case we don't know it's a laundry bag, it has written on there in both Chinese and English, laundry bag. And the slogan goes, no one knows laundry better than the Chinese, okay? We're experts at that. Why we're so good, we even perfected the laundry bag. And so you can still see that, you know, and there was protest about this, and I think they withdrew it because I didn't see it in their catalog anymore recently. This is an ad that, oh, it might actually run. Oh, but that's not in the volume. But this is the famous Calgon ad that probably ran 20 years ago. The customer, the woman comes in and says, Mr. Wong, how do you get your shirt so white? And he sort of says, oh, ancient Chinese secret. And then the wife in the back whips out the Calgon and says, oh, my husband, you know, and this is the secret. So, you know, Chinese, again, are being used for marketing purposes. And even in an artistic sense, I guess the laundry has a certain iconic status in our society. One picture, in fact, actually, Don Kingman himself, whose father was a laundryman, paid homage to the laundry in that oil painting on the right. Okay, so at the end of the day, what's going on, or at the end of the century, the Chinese laundry has kind of disappeared. And at the end of the day, we have the laundrymen hard at work, calculating the bill. They're the laundry package that some artistic photographer, who herself was a child of a laundry, created that picture in an art exhibit. But I think what it sort of says to us is that the laundry played a very significant role in lives of Chinese Americans, and now it really is kind of a relic. It's kind of a thing of the past. We can be maybe a little sentimental about it, but I think we need to recognize that it was a difficult life, and this was the cover of the book I referred to earlier, The Chinese Laundrymen, which was published like in the 1980s, but it's actually based on a sociological study in Chicago that was done back probably in the 1940s, but for reasons that are too long to get into now, didn't come out until the 1980s. It was the first book I ever saw about Chinese laundries, and it was really kind of a revelation. I mean, my first thought was, how interesting. I didn't think anyone could find enough to write about Chinese laundry. And I read it. It was, everything he said, kind of rang true, even though it didn't deal with, my region. It dealt with Chicago. And I learned a lot about, what the lives of laundrymen, even in a place like Chicago, was. So the book, I highly recommend it. And it's the only book I'd ever seen before I tried, doing my own thing. So, kind of in conclusion, what I did the book was, in a sense, sort of a dedication to the ancestors and relatives and so forth who worked hard on this. And in case you can't read in the back, I'll just kind of go over briefly. I just said, in search of the Golden Mountain, you, your sons and brothers came. Some helped forge the rail that links the land from coast to coast. Then, for reasons not of your own making, you were held to blame. Racism denied you basic rights and liberties accorded to most. You were taunted, assaulted, and then excluded from the land. Undaunted, you persevered and worked long hours into the night. Resourceful, you learned to survive by doing laundry by hand. For many, apart years from wife and children was your plight. You slaved, skimped, and saved to have money to send back. Resilient, you endured hardships with a determined attitude. Of courage, endurance, and determination you did not lack, for which your children and theirs owe you lasting gratitude. So that was kind of the motivation that kind of made me want to try to create a sort of a documentation of the laundry as part of our history and a part of American society and culture. So I'd be very happy to answer any questions or like to hear comments. So please feel free to.
Yes. First of all, thank you. I was wondering if you I was wondering if you care to draw parallels between the situation that you described and the current situation, the plight of Mexico.
Yeah, that's an important issue, and I've thought about that some. It's a hard question to answer, entirely. On the one hand, we should have a lot of sympathy for immigrants because we've been close to that struggle and that problem. But in a sense, because their numbers are considerably greater than the Chinese that came over, it was a lot harder for Chinese to come from so far. The problem now with our situation is that there's all this concern about Yeah, thank you. Large numbers coming over more readily. So it's really hard to come up with an easy answer to how to resolve that, but there are certain striking parallels. It's like the Mexicans who are already here, on the one hand, they're doing all the dirty work and the hard labor and out in the fields and so forth. And now that there's economic hard times, it's just like the Chinese, they blame the Chinese for everything and want to drive them out. So the exclusion thing, I mean the expulsion thing, I think is, you know, grossly unfair and unwarranted. I'm not quite sure how to resolve the immigration part, like what's a fair number to come in and so forth, because even Mexican and American themselves disagree quite radically on you know, how they stand on that. Yeah. Yeah. I didn't cover that. You mean politically, like the witch hunts and stuff, the Red Scare and stuff? Right. No, I didn't talk about that. Most of my history is like early in that, but yeah, it was certainly like you know, the McCarthy era, you know, sort of thing, and sort of harassment and interrogations and so forth. I tried not to so much deal with the political side of it. Yeah. Yeah, right. Yeah. Well, I guess I had to limit my scope to some degree, so, you know, I did not really get into any things like that. Yeah.
I'm reading your book, Southern Hard Drives, and I see that your mother was a driving force in this book.
Uh-huh.
And it was her idea to move to San Francisco.
Right.
She could mix with the Chinese community and learn Chinese. Can you comment on that? And how was the adjustment from a small town
Oh, yeah.
down south?
Okay. Sure. Yeah, you're quite right. My mother was a driving force. In fact, when I wrote that book, it was originally intended to be about her, almost exclusively or predominantly, but eventually, for a variety of reasons, it shifted from her, but you're right in your perception. We moved partly because we were isolated culturally and whatever, and so San Francisco certainly seemed a logical place. So my coming here was, I guess I came at 15, so when you're 15, you're somewhat adaptable. I mean, you're not really set in your ways. But at the same time, it wasn't entirely easy. A couple of examples. My mother felt like I should go to Chinese school and learn Chinese. I had some resistance to that. But I went. I went for about a week. Because my classmates were all 6 years old, and I was 15, and they were running circles around me. And I was there, 15 years old, 6'4", and they were little pipsqueaks and making fun of me. So I could relate to anyone who has any learning disabilities. But otherwise, I think in many ways the adjustment was difficult in the sense of, like, I kind of thought magically that, okay, now I'm in San Francisco and I'm with Chinese people and I'm Chinese, and that I would have an instant affinity or like or acceptance. But at the same time, I was a different breed of Chinese. I mean, like, I didn't know a lot about Chinese culture. We had never eaten in a Chinese restaurant, and so I didn't know anything about things like that. And also, because all my life I had to like deal with both whites and blacks because there was no one else for me to deal with, you know, growing up. So I found Chinese in the Bay Area more, I guess you'd call it cliquish or clannish or, you know, standoffish. And I had kind of mixed feelings about that, or, you know, I had to kind of get used to that. And I remember being asked to join the Chinese student club at Lowell High School, and I thought, Chinese student club, what is that, you know? Why do you have that? I mean, I was kind of naive, I didn't know. So those are kind of examples. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's kind of just that. Yeah. Yes.
I certainly congratulate you on writing a book about all that the Chinese and other races had to go through. And I think it's a good trend now. At first, you know, we kids were ashamed of our parents because they didn't know, I mean, they didn't dress well, they didn't speak right. But now I think it's just marvelous that the children realize what they had to go through.
Yeah.
And this is a trend that I certainly recommend, that I certainly admire you for.
Well,
that
thank
we
you.
can read books like this to see what our parents went through and how we should be proud of what they had done.
Yes, thank you very much. I totally agree. And I think in a way, I tell people, I sort of say, like, the older I get, the more Chinese I become. Because for a while, you know, I would almost like forget I was Chinese. And I'd walk by a mirror and I'd say, who's that guy? And then I'd sort of say, oh, well, you know, I'm Chinese. But then I was sort of like, you know, I wasn't fully Chinese, or I wasn't as Chinese as Chinese Americans who grew up in a Chinese community. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, but that, you know, it's like I had to, back to the first question, I had to make that kind of adjustment. And then, like, sometimes I would be so busy with other stuff, I wouldn't even think about Chinese sorts of things. Then, like, growing up, yeah, we were embarrassed that everyone else's parents were doctors, lawyers, merchants, salesmen, whatever, and we lived in laundry, and we did laundry and sort of stuff, you know. But there are things that we shouldn't be embarrassed about. You know, when you really stop to think about it, that they overcame a lot of adversity, and this is true of the restaurant people and the grocery people and so forth. Yeah. So, yeah, sir.
Did you ever come across this article about this municipal judge that was suing this Korean laundryman for $50 million?
Yeah, that was fairly recent. Yeah, that was recently. That's just a travesty. I mean, yeah.
Actually, the laundryman lost money because he had to hire.
Yeah, that's something that's really sad. Yeah, it's sad commentary. Yeah. Yes.
How many of the young generation do you think are aware of their parents' plights and hard work now?
Well,
Are they interested?
okay. Well, it'd be hard for me to give you an authoritative answer on that. I think that with some young people, they need to get led a little bit to it, and once they taste a little, then they get interested. I gave a talk in Atlanta last year at a group called the National Association of Asian American Professionals. And I was a little reluctant to speak to them. I was asked, you know, because this is a highly educated Chinese American organization of young professionals, you know, and I thought that if I went and talked to them about Southern fried rice, that was more the memoir I wanted to kind of hear, that they wouldn't be interested in it. And so I didn't want to go and, you know, talk to people who are not interested when I have to talk about it. I mean, it'd be kind of an uphill battle. But they said that the person who was in charge said, oh, we need to know that sort of stuff. I mean, so I said to them, I don't know what to really tell young people today. I'm going to tell them what to do or what to think. I said, I can tell them what it used to be like, and I can tell them about some historical realities. And they felt they wanted to do it. I went, and there were about 50 people there, and they really resonated well to it. So I think from that one example, I think that if you present material to people that might not know about it or be interested, there are ways to get them interested. Yeah.
From your research, do you find any significance in regional or dialect differences of groups establishing laundries, for example, finding people or say agricultural or supermarkets, or Hubong people in the meat markets?
Well, I can't give a definitive answer on that, but I know there were Chinese laundries all over the United States. I looked at census schedules and so forth. Like one of my examples I use is Iowa. I looked in Iowa, and I found that in 1900 or 1910 there were 64 Chinese in Iowa, and every single one of them was like in their own county. It's almost like they staked out their own territory. Every single one of them ran a laundry. Now, Yeah, see, I thought we were the only ones who were by ourselves, but it was all over the United States. There were other Chinese who were isolated all over in every state that you can imagine. Now, in terms of like who went into grocery and who went into what, I'm doing some interviews now with Mississippi Chinese. And I only knew a few before, but now I know like 15 or 20, and it's sort of a snowball thing because everybody knows everybody because they're all kind of interrelated. And the basic story is some guy is in Mississippi. He's running a grocery store. He has a relative in California. He says, hey, you're having a hard time in California. You come down to Mississippi and you can make more money. And you come and stay with me, and this stuff. And the story repeats itself over and over. So you get people from a certain village, and all of their relatives and descendants all go to the same part of the United States, and they all kind of get in the same business. And the laundry, I can say, you know, I know from my parents' generation and their relatives, they had cousins and uncles or whatever with laundries in Tennessee, Georgia, and Alabama. And so it's that same sort of chain of migration. And I know that doesn't exactly answer your question, but that's kind of why you see certain similarities in the geographical origin of people who are living in a similar place within the United States. I mean, the same place within the United States. Yeah.
I wonder whether you know that laundry
No.
the laundry, and they do cleaning, own machine,
Yeah.
really laundry.
No, I'm not aware of that one, no. The only laundry I know about in Oakland is one that they excavated. After the earthquake, they went and found the 1813 7th Street laundry, and there's an archaeological document about what laundry life was like there. That's the most famous Oakland laundry that I could speak of. Yeah, someone else has? Yes, please, green shirt.
I'm from Seattle, and the only Chinese laundry in Chinatown was my father's.
Oh, uh-huh.
All the rest of the Chinese laundry was in a different districts, quite districts.
Uh-huh.
That's the way it was in Seattle. And then Mississippi, my brother and his friend, you know, I had grocery stores down there.
Exactly. I tried to figure out why in Mississippi there were no laundries. And I think part of it is everything is more rural there, everything is a little smaller, and people are more working in the fields, you know, among the customers that the Chinese had. The Chinese had grocery stores in the black neighborhoods, and that's how they kind of created their niche. That's how they were able to survive economically. There were a few Chinese laundries in like 1890s in Arkansas and Mississippi, but somehow they all disappeared by 1910. And I don't know where they went. They either went out of business, or else those people moved into the grocery business, or else they moved to some other part of the country. I mean, those are the three main, or some of them went back to China. But, yeah, someone else? Yes?
I want to know, how were you considered by the teachers in school?
In Georgia?
Where you went to school?
Oh, okay. I went to school, elementary school in Georgia. I was well received by teachers. There's some advantage if you're smart and if you're well behaved. Teachers seem to have a preference for that. They don't seem to care what skin color you have. We were able to go to white schools. At the same time, though, at that era in Mississippi, they were not allowed to go to white schools. They ended up creating church-related schools in the Southern Baptist Church, or else Chinese would send their children back to China for their education. And then eventually they were able to, you know, break the color line in Mississippi. Where was this? In New York? Yeah, some of that may depend on the individual teacher. You know, some of this might also vary if you're in an area where there's a high population. Like where we were, we're the only ones. And in general, if the group, there's just a handful, you're not perceived as a threat. and you can be more treated as an individual. But as the group size increases, then there tends to be maybe a bit more prejudicial treatment because there's a generalization about that whole group and there's a fear of that group. I'm just making that as a rough generalization, possibly. Yeah. Someone else? Yes? Paul?
Yesterday there was a book review on C-SPAN 2 called Driven Out. It dealt with the entirely the Chinese
Right.
who were severely mistreated in this country and in Canada, including massacres and all sorts of things. And of course, their ultimate successes in organizing and fighting against being driven out legally and so on. But that was so gloomy, what came to my mind was the alternative, how things have really changed. A few years ago, I think 4 years ago, there were ads in Vancouver, British Columbia, on a billboard saying, in Chinese characters, and then below, in English, in small letters, it said, if you can't read the above, maybe you ought to learn how, or something like that. Anyway, that provoked our daughter, who, by the way, speaks Mandarin and can read Chinese characters to an extent. She decided to enter her 4.5-year-old daughter into a Chinese Mandarin class, and which she did do. And of course, our granddaughter just loved it. But she was the youngest by far there, and she was the only non-Chinese in the class. But she just loved it, and she talked about how wonderful she started speaking some Mandarin, and her mother loved it. Well, but then one day she came home crying, and her mother said, well, what happened? What's wrong? She said, well, the teacher said, we are going to start reading Chinese characters next time. And of course, I don't even know how to read English.
Right. Okay. Any other comments? Yes.
How long took you to write this book?
Well, that's a good question. You never really can know exactly when you begin. I mean, it's like incubates and stuff, probably the greater part of maybe a year and a half, but that's just a rough guess. Yeah, well, you got to do a few other things once in a while, off and on, Right. You thinking of writing a book?
No, I was thinking,
Well, it's a labor of love sometimes. So if you like what you're doing, you don't feel like it's work. You sort of get immersed. You find it rewarding. You find it enjoyable. You find it intellectually stimulating. You learn things that are surprising to you. You say, "Wow, that's amazing." I want to share that with other people. So, don't ever try to write a book. I mean, in the sense of saying, don't ever say, tomorrow I'm going to write a book. I mean, kind of at least get halfway done and then say it. That's my belief anyway, because I think if you say it at the beginning, you put too much pressure on yourself. It's like you don't know where you're going. But when you get halfway there, then it's downhill. You've done all this already. Why quit, right? It should be downhill. It should be easy going downhill rather than going uphill.
Did you use a computer?
Yeah, thank God for computers. Yeah. It certainly makes life easier, definitely. Something like that, yeah. Right. Yeah.
How do you make comparison with any other nationality like Japanese or the Koreans and who are also?
Yeah, maybe that'll be my next. I didn't do that.
Laundry business and various areas.
Well, the Chinese really were the first to really get in laundry. Now that the Chinese are out of that and their children are in it. Some of the laundries are going to Vietnamese and Korean immigrants that don't have a lot of education. That's a way of them starting in, but I don't think there's enough of them. And anyway, it's beyond my scope of what I was trying to do. So you have to kind of like define things somewhat. Yeah. Maybe one last question or what? No.
Two more questions.
Okay.
I was wondering, who do you feel encouraged you the most to write this book?
Who encouraged me the most to write the book? Now that's hard to say.
Your mother?
No, as I told people when I talk about Southern Fried Rice, I said usually, it's customary to say, boy, I sure wish my parents could be here to see me now, but I have to say exactly the opposite. I said, well, it's fortunate that my parents can't hear me talk about this because they would be mortified to know that I'm talking about all this stuff. So at the same time, I feel it's important to talk about these things. It's good for other people to know about and learn about, and that's part of the reward because, like, I go and talk to other people, and they say, "Well, we had a similar experience," or that sort of thing, and that kind of validates what I felt. Like when you first write, you don't know what other people feel. You say, "Well, all I can say is this is what I felt." And then when you find like maybe 9 out of 10 other people say, wow, same thing with us, then that's really very powerful incentive. And then maybe that motivates you to go and try to write another book.
One more question. Carolyn?
Thank you very much for giving us such valuable information. I really appreciate your book and writing it up for all of us. I was wondering, has this book been pushed by the Chinese Historical Society or the Chinese American Citizens Alliance? They
Sure.
would love to have this background.
Yeah, I gave a talk in San Diego at the San Diego Chinese Historical Society about a week ago about the laundry book. But that was the first talk. Originally, this was going to be the first public presentation, but San Diego beat you guys out. But actually, I gave a better talk here than I did down there because practice makes perfect. So I figured out what didn't go well the first time, and I improved it now. The Southern Fried Rice I've talked about at a number of different places, including the one in San Francisco, Chinese Historical Society. So I'm making some inroads at like OCA, Organization of Chinese Americans and stuff. So it's just a matter of getting publicity and getting people interested. Yes?
Southern Fried Rice, how that will different from other
Yeah, it's very different.
I'm not sure I entirely understood the question.
I said, you call it Southern Fried Rice, okay? How do you make it different down there?
Oh, okay, yeah, right. I don't know. There was a guy in Mississippi. He was written up in the New York Times and about his recipes for catfish and mustard greens or something. He didn't call it Southern Fried mustard greens or anything, but it's like you adapt things differently. Southern Fried Rice is really more of a creative fiction than anything else. You put a little more of this spice or that spice in there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Did you know we have one of the largest audiences we ever had? And I'm kind of predicting there must be about 20 guests that don't regularly come here. Could the people that don't come here, could you stand up? There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So, and I don't know about these people, and they're standing up too. But thank you so much. I mean, this is a really history in the making here. And I'm pretty sure about 50% were growing up in the grocery store. I was growing up meat market, and my wife was a Chinese grocery store. And Bill there, his father, was plucking chicken. I mean, everybody came the hard way. We weren't born with a silver spoon in our mouth. Well, we know how to sack away money. And so that's why today they're well off. They drive a nice car, a nice home, and everything. Because they learn how to save like you do. every penny counts, you know, every penny goes in a jar. You don't go out and spend on candy and everything else. So I'm sure that we'd like to have him come back and promote his book called Southern Fried Rice. Would you do that? Yeah, the war against country. Meanwhile, he has this book for sale. It retails for over $15. It's $12 without tax. So he's going to stay for lunch, and you can go through this book, and you want to buy it. It's $12 you pay him.